The biggest issue is, I'd say, this 0 to 5, or these maybe 0 to 10-year-olds now. The way that devices have been used in their developmental early years is unprecedented. We've never seen an intrusion of something else into the life of a child like we have with these devices over these last 5 years. So time will tell what the impact of all of that is.
It's horrendous, isn't it? Given that we know far more about children's development now than we ever have. Children are unhappier, more unhealthy, and more developmentally delayed than they've ever been.
Today on Generation Zombie, Raising Healthy Humans in a World of Devices and AI, I'm joined by Sandy Chappell, speech and language therapist, who's been working in this sector for 30 years. A recent report by Speech and Language UK has found that there are 2 million children who are struggling with speech and language in the UK. Sandy, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Charlotte. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Sandy, you've been working in this field for 3 decades. You will have a wealth of experience. You'll have seen how it's changed over these last 3 decades. What have you seen? What changes have you seen?
Levels of specific speech and language disorders, such as developmental language disorder, have stayed pretty much consistent over that time. There's roughly 7.6% of all children have DLD, developmental language disorder. It's the level of the speech and language delays that I've seen a huge increase. We used to see children with particularly delayed language skills, more in areas of social deprivation. So in some areas, children were starting school, roughly 50% of them were starting school with delayed language. That's happening across the board now. It doesn't matter what your family background is, what your parents' educational levels are. And we started to put it down to COVID over the COVID years, but by now we would have expected that to have gone back to pre-COVID levels, and it hasn't. So we're still seeing this steady increase in speech and language delay. And I'm getting more and more reports from nursery teachers and reception teachers of sometimes over half the class are coming in and are barely speaking. It's very worrying.
And what do you think's causing this?
Well, over COVID, there was an increased reliance by parents, particularly on digital devices to pacify and to entertain their children. And that's become a kind of habit now that hasn't gone away because it works. You can very quickly pacify a child that's kicking off, in a supermarket or a restaurant, and children can be very, very easily entertained by devices if parents need to get on and do some jobs. But I don't think parents realise the harms that come with those devices.
I agree with you there. I think it's an issue with education around this topic. I think some people are aware of it, but it's not widespread education. Can you explain to me the mechanism? So how is it that being on a device is prohibitive for language development? What happens?
Well, there are 2 main things, really. One is when a child's on a device, they're not doing something else that is better for their language. Like they're not out and about in groups outside. They're not playing with other children. They're not playing with their parents. They're just sitting, usually on their own, staring at a screen for hours on end. I mean, I regularly see children, 3 and 4 year olds, who are spending 7 or 8 hours a day on a screen. And it's just not normal for children to be so isolated and not be interacting with other people. And that's the other key thing. The one thing that children really need to develop good language is social interaction. So until fairly recently, it was thought that it was just the number of words that was the key factor, the number of words that children heard around them every day that determined how good their language skills would be. But since then, there's been a lot of research that's shown that even more than that, it's the conversational turns. So it starts with babies when you repeat back the sounds that they're making. This activates the speech and language areas of the brain. So very simple things, turn-taking games, even just throwing a ball to each other. The baby or the toddler recognizes this as turn taking, and it activates areas of the brain that screens just can't reach. And we've all seen these gorgeous videos online of parents having these babble conversations with their toddlers, where the parent pretends they understand and interprets what the child is saying. That's perfect for language development. And it goes on right throughout childhood. It's important right through primary and secondary to set aside time to have proper conversations with your child, because language development never stops. Even as adults, we carry on developing our language skills, and the basis of that is conversation.
So actually what you're saying is that time behind a screen it's affecting our interpersonal connection. It's affecting the child's relationship with the world around them. And as a consequence, they're missing out on hearing those spoken words, on turn taking and learning about the rules of language, which is why we're seeing a delay, quite possibly.
Yeah, definitely. And poor social skills go along with that. So children are struggling to form relationships with each other. It's one thing we expect children to naturally be able to do, is to go into a room of other children and start playing and make friends. But more and more we're seeing children who just can't do that because they haven't got the skills.
Yeah, it's really sad, isn't it? And the building blocks of those interpersonal skills start very, very young, that sort of 0 to 4 period. What happens when a child starts school and their speech and language isn't at the level that we would expect it to be?
Well, it affects everything they do at school. So as well as having poor vocabulary and language, what goes along with that is poor attention and listening skills. So they're not paying attention to what the teacher's saying. They can't follow the rules of the classroom. So sometimes they very quickly get labelled as poor listeners or as naughty, but they're not. They just haven't developed those skills that they need. And on the playground, they find it difficult to follow rules of games. Children can set up the most elaborate games with each other, and they have set rules that everyone has to follow. If children have poor language skills, they can't understand those rules. So they either get left out and they're very isolated, or they get very angry and they lash out, and then they start to be labelled as bullies. So yeah, it affects everything they do. And academically, children with delayed language have been shown by age 11, they're 6 times more likely to struggle with literacy and 11 times more likely to struggle with maths. And it follows them right through school, so that by the time they leave school, they're twice as likely to be unemployed and far more likely to end up in the criminal justice system, because the whole way through haven't been able to understand basic rules of the classroom and of the school, so they get into more and more trouble.
And essentially become antisocial.
Absolutely.
Sounds like, well, that's what's happening. That's quite scary, isn't it? So our child starting school at age 4, not being at the level they should be with their speech and language development, can in the long term result in poor outcomes for their lives, employment, criminal justice system. That's really quite frightening, isn't it? But, I, as a psychologist, I absolutely agree with that. And I've seen that trajectory play out as well. So we have to get it right in those very early years. And I think it can be really easy in the early years to sort of think, oh, it's just the early years, they're just little, it'll get better as they get older, without really understanding that what happens in that early year period sets the child off on the trajectory for their life, whether that be good or that be bad. And we can intervene along the way, can't we? So if there is anyone listening whose child is, say, 11 years old, who has spent the last 11 years on a device, what would your advice be to them to start reducing the amount of time they're on screens?
I think particularly at the younger end, it's sometimes easier to start with screen-free areas rather than reducing the time, because certainly the children I work with throughout primary school struggle with concepts of time. So if I said to a child, look, we're going to have half an hour doing this activity, by the time the activity's finished, they're not quite ready because they don't understand what half an hour actually means. So saying to a young child, you can have this phone for 20 minutes is meaningless, really. By the time the 20 minutes is up, it's gone very quickly for them. They're not ready to hand the device back, and it can cause terrible behaviour problems when the parent insists on taking it back. So I would recommend certainly the child's bedroom, not having any devices in there at all, because as you know, it affects the quality of their sleep. And if children go on devices first thing in the morning, it's been shown to affect their concentration and their behaviour for the rest of the day. So that's going to impact them at school. And I think it's easier to set these screen-free areas if parents join in and they don't have their devices. And of course, in a child's bedroom, there's no reason that a parent needs to have their device. So they can say, you know, oh no, none of us are going to have a device in here. Similarly, at the table, you know, meal times are a great time for conversation, for teaching vocabulary, for listening to any worries that your child has from the day that they've had at school. And again, if we say, you know, none of us are going to have devices at the table. My children are all in their 20s now, and we still have that rule, no phones at the table. And they, you know, they accept it if we don't do it, and we don't.
And it needs to start young, doesn't it? I think that's the thing,
Absolutely.
devices, how they're used now and how they've been used since COVID is much more problematic use than we've ever seen before, much more insidious. It's much more integrated into everything. And it's just, as you'll know, you go to a restaurant, it's normal for every parent to seemingly put their toddler in front of these devices. And it's getting worse and worse. So these rules need to start, these sort of family rules, I would say, need to start very young, don't they, for them
Yes.
to work, like you're saying with your family. They've never had devices at the dinner table, so now it's normal for them. And it's creating new social norms, I think, for these young children to say, actually, you're not going to be having devices at the dinner table, none of us will be. And trying to keep that time as sacred, which we're losing sacred family time because there's a device in the middle of every relationship, isn't there? And that's having an impact on all areas of development in children. And I suppose quite profoundly, we are seeing it with speech and language. And crucially, that is essential for our interpersonal skills, our relationship and success in life later down the lines. These devices are a bigger problem than it seems on the isolated, when we look at the isolated stats, it's when we combine all of these things together that the picture that for these children that are children now at this age, the picture for them going forward in the next 10 to 15 years, it's quite worrying, isn't it? If we look to the future, what are we going to be seeing? We're already seeing, growing evidence of mental health problems. Saw some research, was an article yesterday, I think in the Guardian, and they were saying it was a piece that was done, and it said that almost 50% of 18 to 24-year-olds wish there was no internet, They grew up with it, what it's like, and they wished it wasn't there, which I think is sad. They regret that
It
they have.
is. Yeah, it is.
So I think we're going to end up with that. So what would you say is going to be the biggest impact? You have mentioned it there briefly, just talking about how really poor speech and language development in the early years can in the long run lead us more likely to be in the criminal justice system. But what else does it have an impact on for that child throughout their life? Because I think I read some research that said your future earning potential is linked to your speech and language development, speech and language level when you start school. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. Yeah. There have been long-term studies that have followed children. Their vocabulary was assessed at age 4. And they were followed right through school. And it was shown that poor vocabulary at age 4, you could predict poorer outcomes at GCSE, A level, and a person's salary at age 30. So yeah, largely because I think that employers value communication skills above everything else. Even if you don't have the greatest academic achievement, if you're a really good communicator and you can get that across at an interview, you'll stand a much better chance of getting a job. And our communication skills, or children's communication skills now, are getting worse and worse because they're not getting the opportunities to practice.
I think with AI coming in, with the amount that AI is being used, that's only going to exacerbate the problem, isn't it? With in terms of sort of the apps that children use now, what are your thoughts on these speech and language apps that are marketed to young children?
There's very few that have any actual data to support the claims that are made. When I was looking into the apps on the App Store, there's 500,000 that claim to be educational, and they can pretty much say what they want to describe their app, and they don't need any evidence to back it up. So app developers can say this app will teach your child 100 words a week, potentially, and they don't need to have done any research to back up that claim. And parents are spending a lot of money on these apps based on the claims that are made. And so few of them teach children anything. They certainly don't teach children under 3 anything. So a child will be far better off doing anything else. Just playing with the simplest toys, or playing in the garden or at the park, or, anything else at all.
And is there evidence that a child under 3 can't learn anything from an app?
Yes, there is. There's lots of evidence. So these apps shouldn't be allowed to be marketed like that. Some of them are aimed at babies. They're aimed at teaching babies early language skills. And we know that that can't happen via a screen. So it's appalling that they're allowed to get away with it.
It's sad as well, because that's part of our bonding with our baby, is to talk, and actually for the baby to babble and you to babble back. The baby feels heard. It's sort of learning about connecting with you. It's part of forming attachment. Attachment is essential for our healthy psychological development. So to try and displace that parenting responsibility onto an app is damaging it in many, many ways. And having an app raising our child is incredibly questionable. How many words does a child miss out on a day when they are on a screen?
Thousands. Yeah, there have been studies done recently that show for every minute that a child is on a screen, they're missing out on hearing several words, saying several words themselves, and missing out on a whole conversational turn per minute. And the average screen time for a 3-year-old is around 3 hours a day. Sometimes it's a lot higher than that. So they're missing out on hearing thousands of words a day.
It's no wonder, is it, that we've got 2 million children awaiting speech and language support right now?
No, not at all. And those that are on the waiting list for therapy, who would have had a language problem anyway, we're finding that their problems are a lot worse than they would have been, because they need the social interaction, the modelling, the turn taking. They need that more than a typically developing child. So the impact is often greater on them. And then they have so much more work to do when they finally get therapy sessions.
And I'm assuming as well with that actually the system, because we've got so many people needing support, that the ones who really need it, not because of just a device, but because they already had a pre-existing, or they had a developmental delay, can't get through.
They've got to wait like everybody else.
Yeah, and there are people on that list who that could have been prevented by not being on a screen.
Yeah.
And that seems to be seen across the board, really. I think, we're seeing it with neurodiversity, seeing it with speech and language, seeing it with mental health, is that systems are overwhelmed with people waiting for their referrals to come through. But actually, there's a lot of people on these lists where those problems could have been minimised or avoided entirely if devices weren't so commonplace in the hands of young children.
It's one of the first things I say to parents when they come to me for an initial assessment. I ask about screen time, and if it's more than half an hour or so a day, which it almost always is, I recommend that they gradually reduce that time before I see the child again. And I nearly always get incredible feedback about the differences they've seen, not just in potentially the number of words that their child seems to be using, but the child's overall behavior, that's something that parents don't expect. So that's a huge positive for reducing screen time.
Is that commonplace in the guidelines from your governing body that you look at screen time, or no, it's not?
No, not at all. No. In fact, when I talk to speech and language therapists, not very many of them outside our group have seen the evidence. They're not aware of the evidence, and it's out there. And I think there's also a little bit of reluctance to tackle it as an issue with parents because they don't want to be seen to be judging parents. And of course, we're not. But parents deserve the facts. They can't change their family's digital behavior if they don't know the facts. So we have to be honest with them.
I see that across the board, honestly, where people are scared to say anything because of the response of parents. As a parent myself, I would absolutely prefer that someone told me that something I was doing was harming my child if I didn't know it, and then I can take that information and do what I want with it. There does seem to be this almost scared of saying anything anymore in case someone takes it the wrong way. But by doing that, we are essentially allowing this problem to continue and go on. So it does take the professionals. I'm glad we've got the group of professionals we've got who are happy to talk about this and speak up about it. Because you're right, parents deserve to know that these apps that are being marketed to their child are actually more harmful than helpful for their child. It's causing problems which could alter significantly the trajectory of their child's life, which I don't believe that any parent is doing this. It's not about neglect. And it's not about laziness. It is about not realizing just how problematic these devices are because the education isn't out there. And I'm hoping that by sharing this kind of content out there, that we are going to give parents the knowledge to make an informed choice. That's what they need. You take this knowledge, do what you want with it. If you want to give your child a device still, that's entirely your choice. But if you feel that it might be more beneficial to delay the introduction or certainly reduce the amount of time, then you can do that as well. What would you say? Some advice for parents to take away?
I would say delay it for as long as you possibly can. Because once they've got the device, they're going to use it more and more. And in my experience, they don't actually want it most of the time. I did a whole term where I took an iPad in my toy bag, and at the end of every session, I would say to the child, you can choose anything you want out of the bag and I'll play it with you, anything. And occasionally they'd get the iPad out and open it, but then they'd always choose something else. A simple board game or Jenga or anything where they'd be doing something with me and interacting with me. Not once in a whole term did a child choose the iPad. So they don't actually want them. And if you give them another alternative, they'll choose that. If they can play a game with you or do something creative with you, they would much rather do that than sit on their own and look at a screen. But sometimes there isn't an alternative. Parents just hand over the device for whatever reason.
And that becomes the norm, doesn't it? But yeah, children, innately and instinctively are going to want to connect and attach with other humans because we're human at the end of the day. And I think the evidence is that when you put the device in front of the child, it can actually be more frustrating than soothing for them. But like you say, if there isn't an alternative, then the child that's all they know. So then when you do try to take it away when they get older, they find it harder to maybe sit and entertain themselves because they haven't got used to it. These devices have made their way into all of our lives, into society. They're everywhere. They are becoming very antisocial. I could sit and moan about these devices a lot, but what is your biggest phone moan? What annoys you most about how devices are used in society right now?
Do you know, it's a very specific one, actually. It's the North Bridge in Edinburgh. I spend a lot of time in Edinburgh at the moment. We had a son there at uni and now our daughter's at uni there, so we go up quite a lot. And the North Bridge is down to one footpath. So one side has been closed for quite some time for repair. So it's always packed. And most people on that bridge are staring at their phones and not looking where they're going. So you're always got people bumping into you, or you have to move before they bump into you. And I just think it's just a short bridge, you know. Can't you just look away from your phone when you know that it's packed, particularly at certain rush hour times when everyone's trying to get to work, or it's the main route into university, so all the students are going across? You know, it's a 5-minute walk. Can't you put your phones away for 5 minutes?
I think that what you've said there, I see that everywhere. I've noticed it today when I was taking my daughter to school. I said, look, 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 can you see all those people with their face down in their phones pointing out? People just seem to walk around like that. And it's almost this lack of consideration or lack of awareness that you're in a big, wide world with lots of risk and danger. You need to be paying attention to keep yourself safe and also to not bump into other people, like you say. But it's just we've lost that. We seem to be we're losing kind of the social etiquette of our society these days.
Yeah. And even things like, you know, when you're waiting to cross at traffic lights, a few years ago, people would have a very quick chat, say something about the weather, or isn't the traffic horrendous? Or no one does that now. That short time when the lights are on red and you can't cross, everyone's on the phone because they can't be bored for 2 minutes.
And people can't make small talk anymore.
No.
They don't know how to do it. That is a skill, to be able to go in public, speak to someone you don't know and make small talk. And we're seeing that dying out, aren't we? We're seeing it die out with the, you know, people not wanting to talk on the phones, younger generations not wanting to talk on the phone anymore.
Yeah.
Wanting to communicate only via text message. I think with the increase of AI and these AI type, I know, friends, if I'm for want of a better word, where you can talk to the AI pendant and it can talk back to you and it learns about you. We're absolutely losing those skills of being able to speak to some random person that we meet in the street.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot about that with toddlers now, these conversational agents where, you know, toddlers can ask for a particular story, and it just makes me so sad to think of this child on their own listening to this conversational AI agent telling them a story.
Yeah, because the whole storytelling isn't about just hearing that story. It's about the relationship with the primary caregiver. It's not about the story at all, is it? It's about sitting with primary caregiver, having a cuddle, primary caregiver doing silly voices, reading that story out loud. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the child will only learn language from the person, from the primary caregiver. They're not going to learn it from this AI agent that's reading the story.
Yeah. It's the same in nurseries and schools now. I work in nurseries and schools every day, and some still do story time with the teacher reading the book. And when I observe the children, and the dynamic of the classroom in that situation compared to when stories are via a smartboard, which increasingly they are now in nurseries and reception, it's totally different. If a child's watching a teacher read a story, more than half the time, I would say, they're looking at the teacher and not at the book. So they're watching her facial expressions, they're listening for little, like you say, funny voices. If they're just staring at a screen, it's just not the same. And it's so sad that special times like that are being led by devices and not by people.
And it's damaging these kids at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the head and tail of it, isn't it, really? That too
Yeah.
much time in the early years behind devices is damaging some of these key interpersonal skills, especially speech and language development. And then that's having an impact on the child as they enter into the education system and beyond, if there isn't some. I think the problem with it, as well as they enter the education system, and then this issue is compounded by more devices, then their own device, then social media. So it doesn't really get any better, does it? It just sort of gets worse and worse and worse in the way that we're using these devices now. I think the tide's turning. I do. I think we've got Gen Z who are now maturing, who are turning around and saying, actually, I wish I'd never had social media, and I'm resentful that I have spent so much time on the internet. I'm not going to be giving them to my children. So I think I am hoping that in time this situation will turn. But it's the biggest issue is I'd say this 0 to 5 or these maybe 0 to 10-year-olds now, the way that devices have been used in their developmental early years is unprecedented. We've never seen an intrusion of something else into the life of a child like we have with these devices over these last 5 years. So time will tell what the impact of all of that is.
It's horrendous, isn't it? Given that we know far more about children's development now than we ever have, children are unhappier, more unhealthy, and more developmentally delayed than they've ever been.
Yeah. And when you put it like that, I think that says it all, really. We've got the knowledge, we've got the information. So why are we struggling with our young ones right now? What's going on? What is it? What's changed so dramatically in the last decade to have caused this?
Yeah, screens.
Introduction of screen.
It
It
is.
is though, isn't it? I mean, there are other things going on in the wider world, but they don't really affect a young child, or a young child will understand or grasp the concept of some of these things that are going on. The only thing that does really affect them is the fact that they do have their hands on a screen. It's a very direct link to what they're doing in that early years.
We could have predicted a lot of this, couldn't we?
Yeah. And I think
And said,
we can predict what's going to happen in the next 10 years, can't we? If we don't curb this issue now.
yeah,
It's just getting everybody on board to listen to that.
yeah.
Yeah.
I hope you're right that the tide is turning.
I think it is. It's slow and it'll take a long time because it's hard to get rid of these devices. I mean, I wanted to throw mine in the river the other day. I'd love to get rid of it. But then you think, how do you log on to banking? Because it sends a code. Or how do you talk whilst you're driving? How do you use Bluetooth, play your music? All of these things that we don't really realize. But honestly, I would give anything to go back to a time where I had a life without a phone. A landline, so I could talk to people. But you see people more. You go out, you do things, you're around other people and that's what we did, isn't it? We spent more time. Honestly, going back to those simpler times, I think would do us all a world of good if we could all go back there, even just for a month, just to see what it's like to live without our phones. I think some of us would not go back to the devices, honestly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Is there anything you'd want parents to think about when following this podcast? Anything you want to say?
I think parents are under a lot of pressure themselves from social media parenting accounts on like Instagram, and are made to feel that, they're not the perfect parents because they see these wonderful images of activities that parents have set up for their children. So I think sometimes parents think, well, I really can't compete with that. I just can't do that. But this is meant to be educational, this app. So maybe I should use that instead because that's really good for my child. When you think back to a couple of generations ago, parents just didn't have time to play very much at all with their young children. And yet they develop good speech and language. So you don't have to do complicated things. You don't have to spend a lot of money. And you certainly don't have to set up these amazing activities. I would say reading, playing, simple games, singing and music, things like that are excellent for speech and language development. It doesn't have to be complicated.
And even now, I would say, as you were talking then, I was just thinking about, really, you are right that we don't need all these fancy things that we see on social media at all. It is simply, let's take the device away. The child will learn so much just from being in the space, won't they? Being present, listening to mum do what she's doing, dad do what they're doing, siblings or friends, just listening to the chitter chatter or observing what's going on. For a young child, that's already new and overstimulating. It's a lot for a baby anyway, or a toddler, isn't it, or even a young child to process. So we don't need to go all out there and do all these fancy things. Just allowing the child to be present with you and you being present with the child is enough, isn't it?
I think children need time to be bored, because there's going to be a lot of time at school where they're bored, in assemblies and things where they're not really following what's being said by the head teacher. And I think Parents sometimes feel they've got to entertain their children 24/7, and they don't have that time to do that one-to-one. So that's when devices can crop up because it's easy. But parents aren't responsible for entertaining their children 24 hours a day. Your children need time to be bored.
They do. And even just putting some crayons and paper in front of your child, letting them draw or letting them learn how to entertain themselves is, I think that's vital, really, because you need that person to be able to grow up, and as they mature into the teen years and into adulthood, to know how to entertain themselves without having to do something that's highly stimulating.
Yeah.
Allowing those moments of boredom, it's healthy. It's and also, you know, we're at a point where every given moment there's a device sort of effectively rammed down the neck of the child when they wake up, when they're in the car, when they're sat at the dinner table. So the brain never has time to process, to think, to regulate. The brain needs that. It needs that because it needs that space to process what's gone on in the day. Even just sat in the car, looking out the window, thinking, you know, when you pick your child up from school and you say, "What did you do today?" and they ignore you. But it's because they haven't processed it yet. So they need that time to just look out the window, think about their day, and 3 hours later they'll start talking to you about it. But if we constantly put them in front of a screen, they never have any processing time. And I think that contributes to anxiety, it contributes to overwhelm, it contributes to mental health problems that we see later on, is that children never have that space to really reflect and think, process their emotions, work out how they feel about the day. We just don't have room to breathe anymore.
No,
we don't. Well, Sandy, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I think that's been really helpful. In a nutshell, what you're saying is we need to allow children to be present, to connect with their primary caregivers, that children will learn from being around other people more than they will learn from being on a device. And devices can be prohibitive in the development of speech and language, which can then cause problems for that child later on. Great. Well, thank you, Sandy. You've written a book as well, haven't you, Sandy?
yes, I have. Called How to Raise a Chatterbox.
And if we want to buy that, where can we get that?
It's available all good booksellers, Amazon, WH Smith's, Waterstones.
How to Raise a Chatterbox. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sandy.
Thanks, Charlotte.